Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Buongiorno. Welcome to another live recording of FPRI's The Continent podcast. I'm your host, Aaron, and on this podcast, I'm learning about how the war in Ukraine is impacting politics, society, and security in Europe. Each episode, I'm joined by subject matter or local experts to visit, in quotes, a country and to learn about the local dynamics. If you're joining for the first time, don't miss our prior episodes, which you can access just about anywhere you get podcasts as part of our larger Chain Reaction brand. The way I've approached this podcast so far, and this is episode number 9, is, in a sense, as a one-way street. Things happen in Ukraine, and they affect decisions in Europe. But that, in honesty, is not really how it works. We're dealing with feedback loops here. The politics go both ways. Events in Ukraine impact Europe. Europe makes policy towards Ukraine. And events in Ukraine happen because of that policy. Those events, in turn, impact events in Europe, and so on and so forth. Among the many players involved in all of this, it's a safe bet that Vladimir Putin is counting on this feedback, that because of events in Ukraine and the kind of policy feedback, the West will get tired and eventually cease its support for Kiev. And so, we turn to recent events in Italy, where a populist right-wing coalition has taken charge after winning an election this fall. The Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, which is where we get our title from, Giorgia on my mind, has publicly been supportive of Ukraine, but her coalition partners, well, more questionable. As I learned on our episode about the EU, just one country can have a lot of sway on policy matters. So what does this all mean? And why is Italy's populism special? Joining us today is Federico Santi, a specialist on European politics, and somebody I know from my days in political risk. But let's have him introduce himself. Federico, tell us about what you do and what's keeping you busy these days.
Hi, and thank you very much for having me on. I work as a analyst at the Eurasia Group, which is a country risk advisory firm. Our work mainly consists in advising private sector entities, so financial sector firms and multinationals on political and country risk. Essentially trying to look at politics and forecast political developments and how those might affect the economic outlook and financial markets. I myself focus on the European Union, and I'm myself Italian, so my main focus, in fact, is Southern Europe, and Italy has definitely been front and center. Naturally, just given the nature of events in Europe this year, a lot of our work actually relates to EU economic policy and energy in particular, but Italy has certainly been a key component to that story in relation to the conflict in Ukraine, but not only.
Well, that's a great background to have for this episode. We're very excited to have you with us today. So before we dive into the kind of the substance of like what policy is being discussed, I want to ask about what I call the Mr. Rogers question. Like, who are the people in your neighborhood? So I want to ask about both the coalition and kind of political party scene in Italy right now. Who are the parties we need to know about? What sets them apart? What do we need to know about them?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And I know Italy has a somewhat unusual, let's say, political context and culture. So I think it's definitely worth spending a bit of time on the context. Italy held elections at the end of September, which were won quite convincingly by a coalition of right-wing political parties. Some were actually in government recently, some were in the opposition, but unlike the left, which faced the election divided and splintered into a number of competing groups, right-wing parties traditionally in Italy are quite good at always coming together prior to elections and forming electoral alliances. The main reason for this is to take advantage of the electoral system in Italy, which is quite peculiar. Without going into the details, it tends to give a major advantage to coalitions versus parties running individually. And when you look at the results of the election, which has, I think, been portrayed as a major shift towards the right, if not the far right. In fact, the right got a comparable share of the vote. The reason they did so well in terms of the share of seats in parliament is, as I said, precisely thanks to the electoral system. Beyond that, the main winner of the election was Giorgia Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia, or Brothers of Italy party, which is actually named after the first line of the national anthem, which I guess can be described as, or until recently could be described as a fairly fringe party. It's not new to government. It was traditionally part of right-wing coalition government since the 90s, but always as a very junior, fairly marginal partner. The difference this time is that they will be the biggest party on the right, and actually by quite a large distance, and therefore they will not only lead the next government, but will indeed play a major role in it. Now, in terms of the party itself, this has gotten a lot of attention, rightly so, I think, particularly in foreign media. Its lineage, if you will, can be traced back all the way to, the post-fascist party right after World War II. And then it evolved in different iterations to become what it is today. I think it's somewhat unfair to describe it now, today, as a far-right party. And in fact, I think one of the main reasons why Brothers and Giorgia Meloni did so well in the election is precisely because she oversaw a very sharp turn towards the political center. In other words, she brought the party towards the center right and ran a distinctly moderate campaign. And this seems to have really paid off in terms of Brothers' results. Now, she was in part able to do this because the other two parties in the coalition were until recently part of the National Unity government that was underpinning the prime ministership of Mario Draghi, who was, the outgoing prime minister. So, in a sense, Brothers, until a couple of months ago, was really the only party in opposition, and really had no real competitors to its right. So, I think it made sense politically for Meloni to move in that direction. Very briefly on the other two parties before I go on for too long. One being Lega, or formerly known as the Northern League, which is a party that really emerged in the 1990s, originally as a something of a separatist party for northern regions of the country, and the Northeast in particular, which is, of course, one of the wealthiest, most industrialized parts of Italy, lots of cultural differences with the rest of the country. And the party was consistently advocating for, if not independence, at least greater autonomy, particularly when it comes to taxes. Now, since the Eurozone crisis, the days of the financial and Eurozone crisis, Lega's current leader, Matteo Salvini, embraced, let's say, a more nationalist populist strategy, which actually worked really well for Lega up until a couple of years ago, and he chose instead to focus on issues of migration, nationalism, and a very anti-EU type of platform. And again, that initially worked well for Lega, served to propel the party to national prominence, particularly after the 2018 election. More recently, Lega has really suffered as a result of its decision to join Mario Draghi's National Unity government at the height of the pandemic. And a lot of Brothers' gains have actually come at the expense of Lega, which did quite poorly in the election and saw its share of the vote and seats fall by nearly 2/3 if compared to 2018. Lastly, briefly, moving on to discuss the last party in the coalition, Forza Italia. This was traditionally, I guess, the bulwark of all right-wing coalition governments since the early 1990s onward. And it's the party of former Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, who was Prime Minister 4 times over the last 3 decades. And I think it's a figure that I think most people will still be at least tangentially familiar with, even outside of Italy. It's a center-right party. But it too, at this point, has been relegated to the role of junior partner.
Understood. Thank you for that context. That's really helpful to begin our conversation here. So I want to talk a little bit about the campaign that kind of preceded this election that saw the Brothers of Italy do well and kind of rise to prominence. We talked a lot about on this podcast the implications for Ukraine, and also, being a politics specialist on Twitter, it's inescapable. But did Ukraine figure it all into the campaign directly, maybe only its economic consequences? Was it talked about in debates and campaigning? How salient was it?
I think, in short, it certainly featured in the campaign, but it was not one of the main themes. And the war in Ukraine, I think, came as a surprise for the Italian public back in March and certainly dominated a lot of the political discourse initially, at least for the first few months. But come July and August, at the time when the election campaign got underway, I think this had sort of fallen in the order of priorities. And I think issues like the cost of living and the economy, as you would expect, which were much more front and center. I think there are also some, let's say, geographical or cultural reasons for this. Naturally, Italy is, despite being very much affected by some of the economic implications of the war, it's a little bit more far removed from Russia. It has no, historical experience of conflict with Russia, unlike many Eastern European and even Central European countries, of course. And And yeah, I think by the time the election came about, I think the war had lost some of its importance. In fact, it's worth noting that the main center-left party, the Democratic Party, decided to center a lot of its election campaign on the Ukraine conflict and the fact that some of the right-wing parties had historically had very close relations, very friendly relations with Vladimir Putin. But this tactic really did not pay off in the results, and I think is now widely seen after the fact as a misguided political strategy on their part.
So that I think that rings true with some of the, or at least outside of Eastern Europe, some of the broader political dynamics in Western Europe, although of course with a regional flavor. And speaking of regional flavor, before we dive back into our, I don't want to say substantive questions, but actually narrative-focused questions, we're now at my favorite part of the episode, where I ask all the guests who come by to bring a word or phrase or idiom of the day in the local language that maybe describes the local politics or society these days. So, did you bring one today? What do you have for us?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking really hard about this, and a few came to mind. But I think an interesting word to look at, which is really important, I think, in Italian political parlance, is trasformismo, which I guess describes the tendency of Italian politicians, both individual politicians and political parties, to shift either their political allegiances, party memberships, and even their positions with great ease, without necessarily bearing political cost for it. And I think this has been a hallmark of Italian political culture for since Italy has been a country, really, and is, I think, once again relevant today. In recent years, it was maybe best employed to describe the fact that parties would switch with relative ease from one party to another, which either resulted in chronic political instability, but also made it very easy to switch from one government to another without necessarily holding new elections. Again, this is quite unique, I think, to Italy, at least in terms of established Western democracies. More recently, with respect to the new incoming right-wing government, I just find it really striking the extent to which Meloni has, like I said, taken the party towards the center, effected this very sharp shift towards the political center, and not only she has paid no political price for it, but in fact has been rewarded for it. And in fact, we've seen her, after having spent the better part of the last year and a half criticizing the outgoing Draghi administration as the leader of the opposition, very quickly over the span of just a month or two, she has really embraced all the key sort of core policy tenets of the outgoing government, which I think is quite a feat.
Yeah, that's a really great word. I guess one question that comes up related to this, but the role of immigration, I know that's kind of the bread and butter issue, or maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that was the bread and butter issue for a lot of the right-wing parties in Italy, African migration particularly. Is that still a salient issue, or is that something that Meloni has, as you mentioned, distanced herself from?
It is. I think this was a core issue for Lega in particular. I have to say, I think, interest and concern over immigration. I mean, this is still a concern. I think it definitely featured in the election campaign and will be a feature of the focus for the incoming government as well, and something of a flagship issue for right-wing parties, and Lega in particular, a little bit less so in the case of Brothers. But concern about immigration peaked right about 2015-16, which was the height of what's come to be known as the migration crisis in Europe, which involved, as you will know, a huge influx of refugees, mainly from Syria, which was quite sizable also in Italy's case. Not to the extent that we saw in Germany, for instance, which saw as much as 1 million refugees reaching the country over the span of just over a year via the Balkans. In Italy's case, the numbers peaked at around 150,000 a year at that time. But unlike Germany, Italy having you could say no hard borders and a fairly short stretch of sea separating it from Libya, which is, of course, still today a very unstable country. It's something of a chronic issue with no easy solution, and I think something that has haunted successive Italian governments. But since then, the numbers have come down considerably, I think mainly as a result of let's call it closer cooperation between the Italian government and various Libyan militias and Libyan authorities, meaning that this has also lost some of the salience that it had just a few years ago. And also, it's been overtaken to an extent by the pandemic, first of all, which has really changed people's say priorities, and more recently concerns over the economy and the cost of living, as you can imagine.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So turning to this kind of broader populist environment, or the environment that that kind of gave rise to populism in Italy, I want to actually start with a headline from The Economist today, one I hope isn't too biting or offensive, but the headline basically says that that the UK, who the Prime Minister Liz Truss resigns today, a particularly unstable time, but the UK has basically converged on Italy. Yes, the headline goes, "Welcome to Britaly," and the tagline there reads that the comparison to Italy is inescapable. Britain is hobbled by political instability, low growth, and subordination to bond markets. So, without going into necessarily the economics of that, I want to ask about whether this political instability and low growth, is that what gave rise to populism initially?
Yeah, I think it plays a big part. Italy is certainly one EU country has the highest levels of support historically for populist parties. Chronic political instability is a big that just since 2011, it had 7 different governments, which now tend to last an average of 18 months a year in office. And you can see why that would lead time to increasing disaffection with political elites and democratic governance. The economy is the other big factor. I think you're absolutely right. And it's worth going back a little bit about recent history. But Italy essentially did not experience the kind of economic boom that other southern European countries benefited from in the 2000s on the back of what were at the time very low interest rates, thanks to having joined the single currency, the euro. And since then, Italy experienced the financial crisis first, and then the eurozone crisis. What followed was nearly a decade of very low growth, to say stagnation, followed by the pandemic, and now the crisis brought about by the war in Ukraine. So you can see how Italy went from stagnation to crisis to stagnation to another economic crisis, and it's striking the extent to which real incomes in Italy have essentially stayed at the same level where they were in the late 90s or early 2000s. So there has been no material improvement, I think, in most Italians' standards of living, I guess you could say, since then, which also, I think, helps explain the high levels of support for, let's say, non-mainstream, more radical parties at times. But I want to make it one quick but important caveat on this. I know there's a huge economic discussion over how to define populist parties, and I think we need to be a little bit careful here. I mean, as I said, the parties that are now in government definitely have a history of unorthodox economic policy making, anti-EU, anti-immigration, nationalist narratives. But when you actually look at the substance of their economic policies, like I said, I think they've moved to the center quite a bit. So I'm not entirely sure that it's fair to depict them as populist any longer. And this is a trend that we see more broadly across Europe. Populist parties, quote unquote, the closer they get to power, or once they are in power, they inevitably have to face up with the constraints that come with that. And as a result, have had to moderate their positions on a range of issues, and particularly the economy. And I think this process is very clearly at play again in Italy today.
So if I might ask you about, I guess, an early case study of this, I remember that, I believe it's called the Five Star Movement, was one of the very early kind of, again, ostensibly populist party to emerge and then, become a lower in government. And I guess they're not anymore. Whatever happens to them?
Well, yeah, Five Star it's an interesting phenomenon in that it was really a populist party in the sense that it deliberately described itself as a popular movement with no political affiliation, neither on the left or on the right, very anti-elite, and it really surged to prominence in over the last decade, culminating in their convincing election victory in 2018. But after getting to power that year, like I said, they've had to face up to the constraints that come with actually running a country, which means that a lot of the policies that they ran on, they were not really in a position to implement them in full. And there's, I think, a big element of let's say, a steady erosion in support for whoever is in power, which is something that you see time and time again in Italy's case, and Five Star was certainly not immune to that. So since 2018, first they won the election, but they didn't have the numbers to form a government, so they had to partner up quite unexpectedly with Lega, which is a far right party, which alienated some of their, let's say, more left-leaning supporters. When Lega tried to bring down the government just a year later, Five Star was forced into another equally uneasy alliance with the center-left, which in turn alienated some of their more right-leaning supporters. After that, the pandemic came about, was forced, like other parties, to join Draghi's national unity government, which included both the far right and the left. So you can see how that over time will lead a lot of their supporters to become increasingly disaffected, and explains, I think, the steady decline in support that Five Star 2 has suffered as a result.
Makes sense. Now let's turn to this podcast is ostensibly about the war in Ukraine. I think all of this political context is really important to note. But the kind of implications here of the rise of Meloni and the Brothers of Italy, implications for policy towards Ukraine. So I've seen a couple of things. Meloni herself, as far as I've seen, has kind of struck a line that's fairly supportive of Kiev. I think after her victory, it was within a day or two, publicly tweeted at Zelensky saying that we support Ukraine. So that's her. But on the other side, there's news. I would hesitate to call it a scandal just because I lack context. But Berlusconi today, there was leaked audio recording of him praising Putin. They're buddies going back a fairly long time, basically saying it's all Zelensky's fault for this war beginning in the first place. And I know some of her other coalition members have taken a more anti-sanctions stance. I think Salvini particularly, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. How do you see the balance between Meloni and her coalition partners kind of forming, stabilizing, taking shape? What kind of policy do you expect to see?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually think that Italy is unlikely to, let's say, peel off from the EU and NATO consensus on Ukraine. I think it's Italy is rightly seen as a bit of the soft underbelly of the EU in some ways, given like you said, some political parties' friendly stance towards Russia. I think historically there's a lot of opposition to the United States and NATO, and like I said, for cultural reasons, I think Italians are less attuned to the risks that Russia maybe poses. For example, to Eastern European member states. But for the moment, I don't really see Italy's position shifting in a meaningful way. And by that, I mean that Italy will maintain support for sanctions against Russia, support for financial assistance to Ukraine, and even military aid, of which Italy has been providing a fair amount, including heavy weaponry. It's true, both Forza Italia and Lega have very friendly relations towards Russia, have had in the past at least. Meloni, I think, could sense which way the wind was blowing, and after the invasion was very quick to denounce Russia and adopt a staunchly pro-NATO stance. I think, she's quite savvy, and I think she's understood that it's, to rule Italy in opposition to the EU and to Washington is ultimately a self-defeating strategy, because that's where Italy's allegiances lay historically. Very strong economic ties, both with the US and the rest of Europe, of course, and to throw all that away to pursue closer relations with Russia is not very sensible. And I think she's done a good job, I think, of constraining her two coalition partners. Repeatedly, she's made clear that a precondition to be part of the government is to support Ukraine and to stick with the EU consensus. I think there's a question about whether this can be sustained going forward. But for now, we're not particularly worried about this.
So, speaking of the sustainability of this, I mean, Italy has had not a great track record, let's say, for government stability and government's lasting. And I've already heard some rumors about squabbling within the coalition. So, do you think Meloni has what it takes to kind of maintain this government for a sustainable period of time? Do you see the political gravity that has brought down populists before kind of taking its toll? And I guess in political risk parlance, like what signposts are you looking for to see if this government is actually becoming more stable or is more going to be beset by squabbling?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the most important factor here is how support for these parties evolves going forward. For now, Meloni, I think, has a lot of leverage. I mentioned earlier that she did very well in the election. The same cannot be said for neither Forza Italia and particularly Lega, whose results were quite dismal. Salvini has managed so far to stave off a leadership challenge in spite of the very poor result, but his leadership is far from secure. And I think the poor result has served to further empower moderates within the party. And Lega itself, in spite of, Salvini's antics and I guess a reputation as a firebrand, the party actually has very close ties to business, particularly in the country's north, which has historically served as an important constraint on the party leadership and a very important anchor, particularly when it comes to economic policy, but also foreign policy. Same for Forza Italia, by the way. Berlusconi is 86 now, increasingly erratic, and we know of his close friendship to Putin. But the rest of the party, I think, is much more centrist, I guess you could say. His number two, Antonio Tajani, is tipped to be the next foreign minister, and he was for a long time the party's man in Brussels. He was formerly European Commissioner, president of the European Parliament, very much in the pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine camp. So again, that just goes to show that you need to take both Salvini's and Berlusconi's musings with a big grain of salt. Neither of them is really in a position to threaten early elections at the moment to gain leverage vis-a-vis brothers. I mentioned earlier that Ukraine is an important issue for Italians, but not crucial. So I think, ultimately, I think it doesn't make much sense to bring down the government or try and force Meloni's hand on military aid, for example, on this particular issue. Not only that, at the moment, doesn't seem to be any other viable majority in part. How divided and fragmented the opposition is still. So I think for the moment, Meloni has a lot going for her. It definitely won't last forever. We've seen time and time again how political capital erodes very quickly in Italy. But for now, I think she's holding a lot of the cards.
Last question. We mentioned that in this prior context and in this most recent question that Ukraine wasn't really the central political issue, but that inflation and economic questions do remain kind of bread and butter issues, most important and salient for voters. Now, as far as I understand, Italy has had, I don't know if contentious is the right word, but not a fantastic or not a great relationship with the ECB, the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank, as best I understand, favors more of an austere line, constraining spending, fiscal prudence, as far as Germans tends to understand that term. Italian governments have tended to want to spend more. Has that relationship changed? Is that a correct depiction of that relationship? And do you see that relationship evolving under Meloni at all?
It is. I mean, that's been a big point of contention in years past since the Eurozone crisis. But Italy has one huge problem, which is its public debt, which leaves it very vulnerable to shifts in market sentiment, and therefore it's crucial for Italy to maintain financial support from the European Union in order for its public debt to remain sustainable and viable. So this is not an even relationship, and Italy needs the EU a lot more than the EU needs Italy. I would say it's certainly an oversimplification. What this means in practice is that ultimately successive Italian governments have had to maintain a degree of fiscal discipline under pressure from the EU and the European Central Bank. This has changed a little bit since COVID, given that as across the developed world, at least, we saw governments being, essentially undertaking very loose fiscal policies, just throwing money at the economy as a way to prop up the economy in the face of the pandemic. European Union fiscal rules, which constrained public spending before, have been suspended and remain suspended for now as a result. What's changed today is that as a response to very rapidly rising inflation, central banks across the world have had to raise rates and tighten monetary policy. And this again, risks exposing those countries that have a very large public debt to financial market pressures once again. So we could be looking at a repetition of the Eurozone crisis. And this is one reason why Meloni is so constrained in what she can do. So far, I think she has given every indication of having understood this. And it's, I think, the main reason why she moved very quickly on the government to give more money to families, to firms, to households, to respond to the energy crisis, to embracing Draghi's policy of much more responsible fiscal policy, knowing that ultimately it's key for Italy to bring down its public debt in the medium term. And there's only so much that they can do at this point in terms of spending. So she's very pragmatic and much more moderate. It certainly won't be easy for her to walk that line, but I think the starting point and the intentions seem to be more constructive than one might have thought just a couple of months ago when the Draghi government collapsed unexpectedly.
And with that, thank you so much, Federico, for joining today. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope that our listeners have as well. I will turn it back over to Natalia to close out this episode. But thank you again, Federico, and listeners, for joining today.
My pleasure.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and be sure to check out more podcasts, events, and publications on www.fpri.org. Until next time.